dear colleagues. I am greeting you from Kiev, which has been successfully defending itself during more than half of the year. For example, there have been 3 air alarms today in Kiev. The whole world was shocked by the full-scale war against Ukraine, which was unleashed by Putin's Russia on February 24. In its current form, that country repeats everything that Hitler's Germany did during World War II. In Ukraine, the Russians act like fascists, Nazis, and terrorists, shelling schools, hospitals, residential buildings, power plants, killing children, women, prisoners of war, and the elderly. Every day, Ukraine pays for the freedom of all Europe. It pays with the lives of its best sons and daughters. The Russian soldiers wanted to capture Kiev in 3 days and install a puppet government here. But after more than 6 months of resistance from the Ukrainian people and the armed forces of Ukraine, they flee from Ukrainian land in shame after a crushing defeat in Kharkov Oblast, for example, and Kherson Oblast. Governments, parliaments, citizens, charitable and business organizations of many countries of the world also made a great contribution to this future victory of Ukraine. I would like to express once again my immense gratitude for the anti-Russian global coalition for the unprecedented amount of humanitarian and military aid provided to Ukraine, which helped us to endure. Now, let me talk about parliamentarism under conditions of war. In the last parliamentary election held in 2019, newly elected member of parliament accounted for 80% of the Ukrainian parliament, with the political force of the new president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, winning 60% of the seats. None of the member of parliaments in Zelensky's team had any political experience, but this was in line with the demand of the Ukrainians, who were sick and tired of old politicians. This convocation of parliament had to face the most severe tests. Just 6 months after the election came the COVID pandemic, and in February 2020, Russia's full-scale military aggression began. In spite of that, the parliament was able to achieve irreversible positive reforms and modernization. It was before the Great War that Ukraine rose to the #1 place in the world in terms of users' friendliness of electronic services and digitization of public services for all citizens. We opened the land market, initiated a real de-oligarchization, increased defense spending and the level of Ukrainian social security, and created a system of national resistance. Also, before Russia's full-scale military aggression, important digital tools were implemented in the parliament itself. Electronic document management, the possibility of paperless interaction with about 2,000 state institutions. Each member of parliament registered draft law and amendments, appeals and inquiries with the help of his or her digital signature at the workplace, in the building of parliament, or on a tablet at any point on earth. it became possible to hold meeting of committees in online video conference mode. All this also came in handy after the beginning of the war. Most certainly, the war brought about significant adjustment to the work of the Parliament of Ukraine. Just 3 hours after the Russian army had crossed the border and began bombing the capital and other Ukrainian cities, the member of parliament gathered for a plenary meeting and voted on issues of greatest importance for the preservation of the state. They approved the imposition of martial law and established the specifics of the parliament's work for that period. During the permanent missile attacks on Kyiv and the Kremlin statements that they were aimed at decision-making centers, we could not continue the classic parliamentary routine with its long hours of live debates. And although for security reasons, it was necessary to change the place for holding our meeting, the member of parliament decided to sit in the usual hall for plenary meeting in Kyiv under the glass roof. The risk of death was hanging over every Ukrainian. And so the parliamentarians also had to show our country that they were not afraid. They did not hide, but were doing their job protecting the state and motherland. Therefore, all military meetings were held offline in the same premises as before the war. We were forced to cancel the live broadcasting of our plenary meeting, the usual work schedule, and the long discussion of items on the agenda. The list of bills to be considered was agreed upon by the Conciliation Council, which includes the leadership of the parliament, the leaders of parliamentary faction, and the heads of the committees. The parliament entrusted the speaker with determining the time, place, and method of voting. Politics vanished from the parliament. A unified defense coalition began to work. The leaders of parliamentary faction agreed not to record then temporarily the result of MP's personal voting, registering only the total number of votes for or against, although practically all laws were supported almost unanimously. It was necessary to urgently change the legislation and respond to the events that were dramatic and tragic for dozens of millions of Ukrainians, to counter the aggression, seizure of populated areas, occupation, the enemy's special information operations, war crimes, destruction of home and businesses, misuse of humanitarian aid, collaborationism, and also to focus on increasing the defense capability, the social security of the defenders of Ukraine, accommodation of forced migrants, evacuation of the population, incentives for business, assistance in its relocation to the west of our country. It was necessary for the parliament to make decision on putting the financial and economic law enforcement, judicial, educational, healthcare, social, and other systems for the state on a war footing, on allocating additional funds for the army and the help for war victims, on introducing a budget-saving mode, and on sending appeals to international organizations, parliaments, and governments of the world. Most of the laws were adopted without the procedure of two readings, at once as a whole, often without discussions, but their texts were agreed upon by all the political forces present in the parliament. Discussions and disputes between representatives of faction went on before the consideration of the bills for 5-6 hours or more each day. But to some extent, this became a substitute for public debates on political topics. However, decisions were made by consensus, and so each political force in the parliament actually had the right to veto any law during the first 2-3 months of the war. Such wartime system of work proved to be effective and efficient. Since February 24, we adopted 246 laws as a whole, 28 of which were new primarily laws. This is almost twice as many compared to last year's analogous peacetime period. At the same time, after the fight of Russian troops from Kiev and the weakening of the threat of capture of the capital from about mid-April, certain political forces began to occasionally use pre-war elements of parliamentary obstruction and populism to each higher personal political ratings. Long statements, political competition, and even amendments spam to extend meeting were partially back, partially back. Deputy factions and groups that are not part of the coalition began to more actively criticize the government and probably to prepare for the next election, which according to Constitution of Ukraine can only be held after the end of the war, so after the victory of Ukraine. Thus, Ukraine remains a free and democratic state with pluralism of thoughts, and parliamentarism in Ukraine is gradually returning to the classical parameters. Summing up, I would like to note that since the beginning of the war, the parliament not only retained its capacity, but also, according to many experts, increased its effectiveness and became an important factor in Ukraine's successful resistance to the Kremlin's aggressive actions. Many members of parliaments became active participants and leaders of the volunteer movement. Another important area of the work was constant communication with our foreign colleagues to spread the truth about the war and to actualize Ukraine's needs, the necessity to increase the pressure of sanctions on Russia and turn it into a rogue state. The parliament, just like the entire Ukrainian society, consolidated around the supreme commander-in-chief, President Volodymyr Zelensky, who united not only all Ukrainians, but also most of the inhabitants of the planet and many leaders of the world's states in opposition to the aggressor and in provision of maximum support to Ukraine. Under their unquestionable leadership of President Zelensky, the parliament also made a significant contribution to Ukraine's obtainment of the status of European Union candidate member in a record short time, which reflect historical justice and the aspirations of the Ukrainian people. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that under the influence of military defeats, economic downturn, sanctions, and visa restriction, the Russian elites and diplomats will be more actively looking for ways to return to peace. The conditions for that peace and for the lifting of international sanctions against Russia should include not only bringing the political leadership of the aggressor country to international responsibility and compensating Ukraine for all the damage caused, but also changing the status and role of Russia in the world order. No democratization or change of the political regime in Russia will be a guarantee of long-term peace and stability in Europe in the Russian Empire persist in its current form with that nuclear button, So now in Kiev, the air alarm starts. Maybe you hear the siren. So I'm finishing. Therefore, I call on everyone to think about the need for voluntary nuclear disarmament, de-imperialization, or division of Russia into several states as the sole prerequisite for reducing the pressure of sanction on it. This corresponds to the interests not only of the Europeans, but also of Russia's peoples and citizens themselves. Thank you for your attention and glory to Ukraine.